Ladies and gentlemen, in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing Planetside 2 on the PC and PlayStation 4 and cross-platform play. Now, this is a really good analogy, actually, for other titles that are going to be on the PlayStation 4 and PC, because, as many people have pointed out, and it's been said all along, the PC and PlayStation 4, as well as Xbox One, but we're going to leave that somewhat out of this video. We're going to focus primarily on the PS4. Of course, are very similar to the PC architecture, and so many are starting to wonder just how easy it's going to be with the porting process. And developers who are working on Planetside 2 have spoken in a couple of interviews on just how the porting process works, as well as a little bit of inside information on their engine, and it's just nice to know. So we're gonna just do a brief analysis on this stuff, and hopefully we can become somewhat more informed. First things first, let's talk about the somewhat less technical aspect, and let's talk about cross-platform play. I'm going to read you guys out a quote. Matt Higbee, I'll repeat that again, Matt Higbee, he is the creative director of Planetside 2, and said that all PC content patches will appear on the PlayStation 4. However, there is most likely not going to be cross-platform play. It's not possible, and he went into some details why, and I'm going to read you guys a direct quote. Because of the update Candace, the additional steps you have to go through to be able to release the update on the PlayStation Network, we're not going to be able to keep our servers in sync, so you won't be able to just play the same people. They might be a week behind in terms of patching, or a day behind, or whatever it ends up being, but we can't really have that. But we are talking about having character portability, so a PC character can be transferred to the PlayStation 4 and then back. The characters format the same on both, so it's purely a matter of server updates. Now, out of quote for a moment, let's just talk about this just for a second, in case you're not exactly sure what he means by server updates. I'm sure many of you understood it, but I'm just going to go into it a little bit before we get into the technical stuff. To play an online game, your version of the game needs to be the same that's on the server. Fairly simple, right? So in other words, let's say, just make these easy. Let's say that you have version 1 and version 2 and version 3. I'm not going to bother to go into that 1.1, 1.2 because it makes things a bit more complicated to say. So let's just say 1 and 2 and so on. So let's say that you have on there, let's say you're playing on the PlayStation 4, and let's say that I'm playing on PC. And let's say that you're playing version 1, and let's say that I'm playing version 2. Now, obviously, us two can't play together because there may be either additional content on version 2, which, of course, is slightly released, slightly ahead of time in terms of the PlayStation 4, so it's a little bit sooner on PC, because there might be bug fixes, additional content, there may be additional characters, maybe different levels, maybe balance changes. For example, one weapon could do slightly less damage, or maybe one weapon could do a little bit more damage. There may be netcode differences, and goodness knows what else besides. And all of these little things make huge differences on the game itself. And you might not think that, you know, just one little version number can do it, but it really can. And so obviously that's why, for example, when you're logging on to a game, whatever it is, you have to make sure that you've got the latest version if you want to play on a server. And so basically, because of the quality control methods and the way that the PlayStation Network itself is run and updated in terms of its update cycle, there's obviously going to be a period of time, a time lapse between the two. For example, it could be that an update is released on one day, but then, you know, 2 days later it'll be available on the PlayStation Network, or it could be as much as a week difference, depending on when all the updates are scheduled. So obviously you can't really have that, because then it might be like 4 days, just for example, an arbitrary number, but still, there could be 4 days where the PlayStation owner is going to be out of sync with the PC, and that doesn't really work for either platform. And so it's better just to keep the separate platforms available to play. Another benefit, of course, however, that they have mentioned in that is that your character at least can be ported over, so his stats and your, you know, ratios and whatever equipment or whatever, just for example, depending on the game. But let's just assume for a moment Planetside, then at least your character can be ported over, and that's pretty cool. So now let's talk about the more technical side of this, the more technical aspect, and talk about the engine. Now, it's not exactly super in-depth stuff compared to what we've covered recently on the channel, but it's still a nice little tidbit of information. And I'm going to read you guys out the quotes first, and then we'll get into a little bit of analysis, of course. To engineer the game for the PS4 is a lot easier because you have a consistent set of hardware that you're going to optimize against. It really is a challenge to optimize high-end PC games to be able to work on a pantheon of hardware that's available for players nowadays. It's just insane. The PS4 is a much more consistent, stable platform for us to be able to develop for. The big challenge on the PS4 is the AMD chip. It relies heavily on multi-threading. We have exact same Achilles heel for the PC too. People who have AMD chips have a disadvantage because of a single core AMD chip doesn't provide as much horsepower, and they really require you to spread out the load across multiple cores to be able to take full advantage of the AMD processors. Our engine sucks right now at this. We are multi-threaded, but the main gameplay thread is very expensive. It's the biggest piece of engineering work that they are doing right now, and it's an enormous effort to go back through the engine and re-optimize it to be truly multi-threaded and break the gameplay thread up. It's a very, very challenging thing because we're doing a lot of stuff, tracking all the different players, all their movements, all the projectiles, all the physics they're doing, and a lot more besides. It's very, very challenging to split those closely connected pieces of functionality across in multiple threads. So it's a big engineering task for them to do that, but thankfully once they do it, AMD players who have been playing suboptimal performance on the PC will suddenly get a massive boost, just because being able to take the engine and re-implement it to a multi-thread environment. I'm very excited about that because I have a lot of friends, lots of people who are more budget minded going for AMD processors because 9 times out of 10 they're giving a lot more bang for the buck. Where it really breaks down is on games that are really big threaded. Planetside is probably a prime example of that. End quote for now. So this is actually a really important aspect that we've somewhat touched upon before and spoken about it quite in depth in a couple of videos actually, to be fair, but it's mostly and primarily to do with the CPU side of things. Now, we do know that the AMD Jaguar CPU that of course is powering the PlayStation 4 works on an APU design, so it of course does rely heavily on the GPU to do some of the compute functionalities, but some things can only be run really well on the CPU. However, just as a slight aside, I have a feeling that later on in the game they could start putting some of this stuff, such as physics possibly, on the GPU, which would be quite nice. But just for now, the thing of the matter is that the AMD CPU per core is not that powerful. It's, you know, low to mid-range in terms of PC specifications. And this is another problem that a lot of PC gamers have been having who run AMD setups. The problem is getting somewhat less noticeable on a lot of titles because games are becoming a lot more multi-thread friendly, if you like. But Intel typically win, not just because you know, they are the better company or whatever, but it's just because of the way their chips work per thread, or should I say per core per thread. They just handle things better. So in other words, they can process a single thread on a single core a lot faster, whereas AMD typically rely more on the multi-threaded approach. Basically, what this good fellow is saying is that currently their engine does rely on multi-threads, fine, but the problem is that the main one thread in particular requires a lot more processing than the other ones. So in other words, that main thread is disproportionately more hungry than the remainders, and so they're basically trying to pick that thread apart and trying to separate the thread to become more, more multi-thread environment friendly. And if they can do that quite well, then of course performance in the whole board does go up. Now, we have started to see, as I've mentioned before in previous videos, titles such as, say, Crysis, which does Crysis 3, which performs pretty damn admirably on the AMD CPUs, and titles are starting to become better. Especially, you've got to bear in mind that the PlayStation 4 does have 8 cores, as well as it turns out as the Xbox. So because it does have so many cores in it, there's a good probability that PCs are going to start to really benefit. AMD, as it turns out as well, are going to benefit quite heavily from this, because obviously their processors typically have like 6 cores or whatever, whereas Intel's typically has 4 for the same kind of price range as well. Sometimes even cheaper for AMD, but it's just because the AMD's processors just perform slightly worse per clock. And so it's a little bit tricky at the moment for AMD in terms of gaming, but things are going to get better, especially for titles like Planetside, as I've said, which are going to be starting to optimize more. So no doubt a lot of the stuff is going to kind of leak onto PCs as well. I think we've got the situation right now where Intel definitely is scoring really highly. John Carmack has even mentioned that during the QuakeCon interview as well. He also mentioned some other stuff regarding cell phones and tablets and various other bits and bobs as well. It's quite an interesting view, so I suggest you guys check that out. But it's very, very much a case where we're in this transitory time at the moment, especially the next year or so, because the CPUs and the architectures are so different from, say, the, PS3 to say the PS4. It's not a subtle, difference. It's quite profound actually, and so they're still trying to get used to this x86/64 architecture, and that's one of the reasons that certain developers are starting to use the PC as a lead development platform because of this. Obviously, there are other issues as well that are gonna come into play, such as APIs, drivers, and goodness knows what else, as well as GPU power. But for right now, I think they're just trying to figure out how to split the codes up. And I know I've used this a couple of times, but John Carmack himself has said that, these engines are so complicated now. It's not just a simple case of just pressing a couple of buttons and everything works and everything's great. It's not, you've got so much data, so many different hardware threads, and so many different functions and graphics functions and memory functions and goodness knows what else, and these teams are so big. It takes so long to be able to just change something that has been working for so long. So we're going to be seeing some suboptimal performance for a while, I think, but certainly it's nothing that they won't be able to fix and improve given a little bit of time. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the somewhat brief video for me. I know that it's unusual for my videos to be anything less than about 20 to 30 minutes. Regardless, hopefully you've enjoyed it. I will see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.